"You're disgusting, old woman." And then it landed wet and hot on my cheek. For a second, I didn't move, just stood there in my kitchen, my hand still resting on the grocery list I had scribbled on a receipt. Mason turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, like I was nothing more than a stranger who'd insulted him in public. He didn't even look back. His wife Alina leaned against the fridge with her arms crossed like she'd been waiting for the moment. No shock on her face, just quiet satisfaction. She didn't say a word, just followed him out, slow and smug. I wiped my cheek with the back of my sleeve. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't cursed. I had asked one simple thing: could they help cover the groceries this month? Eggs were up again, and my pension only stretched so far. But somehow, asking for help in my own house had become an unforgivable sin. This house wasn't fancy, just 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, and an old porch swing that still creaked when the wind hit just right. But it was mine, paid off over 30 years. This kitchen, where I now stood like an unwanted guest, had seen birthday cakes, scraped knees, and late-night talks over burnt coffee. When Mason lost his business 3 years ago, I told him they could stay here as long as they needed. I meant it. I cooked. I cleaned. I kept the thermostat low to save money. I even gave them the master bedroom so they could have more space. And this was the return spit on my face rage in his eyes, and a wife who looked at me like I was a stain on her marble countertop. I stood there a long while after the door slammed. Then I picked up the receipt, tore it in half, and dropped it in the trash. I didn't need to ask again. He was supposed to stay for a month, 2 at most, just until he figured things out after the business went under. I remember the day he called me, voice low and shaky, asking if he and Alina could come just for a little while. I didn't even hesitate. I told him the door was open like it always had been. That was 3 years ago. Since then, the guest room became their room. My fridge became their storage. And I became something else? A cook, a maid, a silent fixture in the background of their lives. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being mom and started being her. Alina barely tried to hide it. The way she sighed whenever I spoke. The way she re-washed dishes I'd already cleaned. If I asked a question, she'd answer like I was a child interrupting grown-up talk. Mason never corrected her. He never looked up from his phone. I used to think maybe I'd remarry someday. There was a kind man, Paul, from church, who used to bring me fresh peaches every summer. But Mason never liked him. And back then I thought making sure Mason felt secure was more important than my own second chance. I told Paul I wasn't ready. He stopped coming after that. Mason never knew what I gave up. The late nights helping him write college essays. The weekends I spent tutoring just to cover his cleats and school trips. The holidays I skipped because double pay meant he'd have something better under the tree. I gave him everything. And somewhere along the line, I taught him that giving didn't have to be returned. Now I boil water in silence. Their door is shut. The television blares from their room like nothing happened. But the sting on my cheek lingers even after I washed it clean. I walk to the hall closet, pull down the metal box with my name etched in black marker. I haven't touched it in years, but tonight I opened the lid. It was late past midnight. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water and heard his voice from the living room, low but clear enough. "Yeah, I got the house," Mason said, laughing into the phone. "Technically, it's hers, but I handle everything. She's basically my dependent." I froze. The way he said it, like I was some old burden he'd been saddled with. Like I hadn't given him everything I had. I stood in the hallway just behind the wall, hand gripping the doorframe until my knuckles ached. "She can't handle much on her own anymore," he continued. "Alina's been patient, but we're trying to figure out how to make this long-term, long-term. Like I was the problem. Like they were the solution." I stayed still, until I heard the TV switch on. Then I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling for hours, blinking into the dark. The next morning, while they were out at brunch, paid for, I assumed with my food stamps or guilt, I pulled out the folder from the filing cabinet in my closet. Property taxes, utilities, internet, phone, even the damn pest control, every single bill was in my name. My social. My money. There wasn't a single account with Mason listed on it. I looked again, just to be sure. The electricity bill showed auto-pay from my checking account. The mortgage had been paid off years ago by me. The house, from foundation to attic, was still legally and financially mine. But somehow, Mason had painted a story where he was the caretaker and I was the weight. And Alina believed it. Of course she did. I'd heard her say once, "We're doing all we can to support your mom, babe. Maybe she should consider assisted living." I sat at the table, papers spread in front of me, feeling a strange calm settle over my chest. They had built a story around me. Now it was time to write my own. I remember the day I sold my engagement ring. It was a Tuesday. Rainy. The pawn shop smelled like metal and cigarettes. The man behind the counter turned the ring over in his hand like it meant nothing. To him, it didn't. To me, it was the last piece of a life I used to have. But Mason needed a laptop. Freshman year. Engineering program. I can't be the only one without one. He'd said, frustrated, like I didn't understand. I handed the man the ring without a word and took the cash. He never asked where the laptop came from, just ripped the box open and went back upstairs. I worked night shifts during those years, supervising GED testing for the local community college and helping clean classrooms after. I'd come home at 2 a.m., feet, swollen eyes burning, but the tuition bill was due and I wasn't going to let him drop out. His friends used to fill our kitchen after school. They'd crowd the table, laugh too loud, leave crumbs everywhere. I didn't mind. I made grilled cheese with whatever I had, sometimes just one slice of cheese split 4 ways, and brewed coffee to keep myself awake. They always said, "Thank you." Mason never did. There was a day, I don't even know which year anymore, when I fainted. I was folding laundry and just went down. Woke up minutes later on the floor, dizzy, heart racing. Mason came home an hour later, dropped his backpack, asked if I could give him $200 for books. I said yes. Because I always did. That's what still haunts me. Not that he forgot, but that maybe he never really looked. Never truly saw the woman behind the sacrifices. The nights I held back tears so he could sleep peacefully. The way I clipped coupons and stretched leftovers. The silence I kept so he could feel strong. I look at the stack of papers still on the kitchen table. Ownership, deeds, bank accounts. All in my name. Maybe it's time he sees something for the first time. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't even ask why. The answer had been growing inside me for years, like dust behind furniture. Quiet, ignored, but always there. The morning after Mason's phone call and the memory of that ring I'd once sold, I brewed a pot of coffee, poured myself a cup, and carried it back to my room. I locked the door, not because I was afraid, but because I needed a moment where no one could interrupt me. No footsteps, no eye rolls, no dismissive laughs from down the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the old folder from the bottom drawer. The one I hadn't touched since the mortgage was paid off. I opened it slowly, like it might bite. There it was. The deed. My name alone. No co-owner. No power of attorney. No second signature. No one had taken anything from me. I had just forgotten I still held it. I called the lawyer first. His receptionist remembered me from years ago. "Of course, Ms. Marsh. He can call you back within the hour." And he did. I told him I wanted to initiate the sale of my property. He asked if I was sure. "I'm not sure of much anymore," I said, "but I'm sure of this." Then I called a realtor. a young woman named Tessa, full of energy and unbothered by the word as is. She came by twice, quiet and efficient, while Mason and Alina were out, took photos, measured square footage, kept her car parked 2 houses down. It took 3 weeks. During that time, I folded laundry, made dinners, and listened to Mason complain about internet speed and his wife's prenatal vitamins. He didn't ask about the mail that stopped arriving in my name. He didn't ask about the manila envelope I kept in my purse. They never saw it coming. They thought I was quiet because I was weak, but I was quiet because I was preparing. And one morning before the sun rose, I left. I left before the birds did. The house was still the hallway dark. I didn't bother turning on the lights. My bags were already packed, just 2 of them. One with clothes, the other with what mattered, my journals, the photo of Mason when he was 5, and the ceramic coffee mug I'd used every morning since 1998. A Mother's Day gift back when he still called me Mommy. No dishes clattered, no door creaked. I moved like I'd rehearsed it in my mind because I had 100 times. I didn't leave a note, just the folder right in the middle of the kitchen table, the deed transfer, the lawyer's stamped notice. A clean legal reminder that they had 30 days to find somewhere else. No explanations. No apologies. Just my signature. The front door closed behind me like it was letting out the last breath I'd been holding for too long. The sky was still ink dark. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, looking at the porch swing. I didn't take the cushions. I didn't take the quilt I'd hand-stitched and left on the back of the couch. I didn't take anything that could tie me to that house again. I slid the key into the mailbox. Let it go. My car was already gassed up. The road stretched out ahead, quiet and empty. I turned south toward Asheville, where an old friend had once told me the mountains catch the morning light like they're holding it just for you. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. It wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about motion. About finally moving in a direction that wasn't backward. By the time the sun peeked over the hills, I was halfway there. Coffee in hand, peace sitting in the passenger seat. I didn't know what waited for me. I didn't care, because for the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't heavy. It was full of possibility. I found the space by accident, an old storefront tucked between a bakery and a plant shop, with peeling blue paint and dusty windows. The rent was manageable, and the landlord didn't blink when I said I had no recent business experience. Sometimes he said the best things start from scratch. I called it Marshlight, a mix of my name and what I needed most light. Not the bright, blinding kind. The quiet, steady kind that stays with you when everything else fades. I filled the shelves with what I knew: used teaching guides, vintage children's books, hand-bound notebooks, and greeting cards made from scraps of fabric and dried leaves. I stayed late those first few weeks, cutting paper by hand, writing price tags with a black pen and a ruler. People came. Locals wandered in curious. Tourists found me by accident and stayed for conversation. A woman brought in her late mother's books and cried when I displayed them in the front window. A teenage girl started volunteering on weekends just to be around something that smells like stories. I learned their names. They learned mine. And slowly, the tightness in my chest began to ease. I didn't need to keep my voice soft. No one rolled their eyes when I offered coffee. No one sighed when I gave advice. I laughed again, really laughed over shared muffins and missed phone calls and one customer's surprise proposal right near the register. At night, I slept through until morning. No creaking hallway, no passive-aggressive comments through closed doors, just the hum of a quiet street, the rustle of wind through old shutters, and the knowledge that I had built something on my own, for myself. I stopped waiting for a knock on the door. I stopped wondering if Mason would call. Each morning, I sat by the window with my chipped mug and watched the sun warm the awning of my little shop. And one afternoon, just before closing, I saw an envelope in the mail slot with Mason's handwriting on the front. He didn't say much in the letter, just that he understood now, that sometimes you don't see what's breaking until it's already fallen apart. I read it twice. Not because I was deciding whether to forgive him, but because I wanted to know if the voice on the page sounded like the boy I once knew. After I left, Mason's world cracked open. The house sold faster than he expected. He called the lawyer 3 times trying to contest the sale, but the paperwork was airtight. My name was the only one that ever mattered. Alina left him 2 weeks later, said she couldn't deal with the instability, took half of what they had, and moved in with her sister. Mason tried to save face telling friends it was mutual. It wasn't. Then the lawsuit came from an old business partner he'd lied to. Something about misused funds and unpaid loans. It spiraled fast. And with no roof of his own, no wife to lean on, and no narrative left to spin, he finally did what he never thought he would. He went to therapy. At first, it was just to prove something to the court. A requirement for mediation. But something shifted. The therapist asked questions he hadn't prepared for. Questions about his childhood, about the long nights I wasn't home, about the way he always felt owed, even when everything he had came from me. Somewhere in those sessions, he began piecing together a version of me he'd never noticed. A counselor recommended he try repair steps, a fancy term for making things right. That's when he found the storage unit. I'd paid the fee for 6 months in advance. Left the key with the front desk, just in case. Inside was a plastic tub with his name on it. Baby shoes. A drawing he made in 2nd grade. Photos of him in his cap and gown, and a journal. In it I told him that love isn't loud. It doesn't always knock. But it waits sometimes in silence. And sometimes it lets go. The next letter arrived 2 weeks later. The envelope was thin. No return address. Just my name in his handwriting neater than I remembered. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, turned the sign on the shop door to closed, and sat at the little desk behind the counter where I handled inventory. Then quietly, I opened it. It wasn't long. No dramatic buildup. No manipulation. Just words. I was cruel, he wrote. I confused your love with weakness. I see it now, how often you gave without asking, how often I took without noticing. I'm in therapy. Real therapy. I didn't think it would do much at first, but it's made me sit with things I used to blame you for. I stopped reading there for a moment. My hand was steady. My breath calm. No tears. I read on. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing to fix anything. I just needed you to know that I've started seeing you, really seeing you for the first time. And I hope wherever you are, you're okay. No excuses. No begging. Just a slow confession, written in the kind of language that doesn't come easy to men like Mason. I folded the letter once, then twice. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief or rage. What I felt was space, like something had moved out of me, leaving room I didn't know I needed. I didn't write back. Not yet. I didn't owe him that, but I also didn't throw the letter away. I placed it in the top drawer of the desk beneath a stack of order forms and a half-used notepad. Somewhere he couldn't see, but I could find if I ever wanted to. That night, I lit a candle in the window of marshlight. Not for him, not for what was lost, just for myself. And the next morning, before I opened the shop, I brewed a second cup of coffee, one for me and one for someone I wasn't sure would show up. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. The kind of quiet hour when sunlight falls gently through the front window and the bell above the door barely makes a sound. I was restocking a shelf of poetry when I heard its soft, deliberate footsteps on old wood floors. When I turned, Mason was already standing there. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not in size, but in spirit. like the weight he used to throw around had fallen off somewhere between then and now. He didn't say hello, just offered a nod, then stepped forward and placed a worn hardcover book on the counter. The title was handwritten across the front in silver ink. The Mother I Forgot I Had. He said nothing as I picked it up and opened the cover. Inside were pages of reflections. Childhood memories stitched together with the kind of honesty that can only come from breaking. There were stories I hadn't told him in years now, retold in his voice through older eyes. And on the first page, one line underlined in ink. You weren't disgusting. You were disappearing, and I never asked why. I didn't move for a moment. The shop stayed quiet. The old clock ticked softly on the wall. My hand rested on the page. Then I closed the book. Would you like a coffee? I asked. He nodded. No words. Just a quiet, grateful nod. I poured 2 cups, set them down on the small table near the window. We sat there in silence, the kind that felt like a beginning instead of an ending. We didn't talk about the house, or the letters, or the time that stretched between my absence and his return. We didn't need to. He reached for his cup with both hands, like it was the first warmth he'd allowed himself in a long time. I took a sip of mine and looked out the window. The light had changed. Softer. Maybe healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Maybe it just walks through the door carrying a book and waiting to be let in.